Hello everyone, this is Dr. Watts again, and today we are going to continue our discussion of the market system and specifically taxes and subsidies. Now, we have talked about supply and demand, equilibrium, so where prices come from and why they change. And then we talked about price control, so how if you force the price to stay out of equilibrium, how that causes problems, and market forces want to push the price back to equilibrium. And then we went on and talked about this concept of elasticity. We focused mostly on elasticity of demand, but I think I mentioned in the elasticity lecture that there's also a elasticity of supply. And you can kind of think about that as the steepness of a demand or supply curve. The definition, of course, you'll recall, is how responsive the quantity that people buy or sell is to a change in the price. Okay, so now that we have all those tools under our belt, supply curve, demand curve, equilibrium, elasticity, now we can start to do some really concrete applications, and one of those has to do with taxes and subsidies. So we can use the supply and demand framework here to really think through in a careful way how taxes and subsidies work. So let's jump in. First off, taxes. Now, of course, we know that governments need taxes to fund various projects, and we're not making judgments about those projects. That we might agree in a political system that those projects are very worthwhile. Things like the police and having good roads, law and order, public goods, public health, right? That's all for the political process to decide. We're value free. We're not going to make value judgments. We'll just say that there's a given consensus on what the people want through the political system. Okay, so we know what taxes are for, however you feel about them. What we want to do is analyze how taxes work and who pays them within a supply and demand framework. So the easiest tax to analyze is going to be a commodity tax. That is a tax that's placed directly on goods. So you buy the product, you pay sometimes a certain percentage of its value or sometimes just a certain dollar amount based on the value of the product. The most common examples of this in the United States would be the gasoline tax. Now let's start with some truths about commodity taxation, and you might find these kind of interesting. Who pays these taxes does not depend on who the government makes responsible for collecting it. So sometimes they could levy it on the buyer, you have to pay when you buy. Sometimes they could levy it on the seller. The seller has to remit the taxes after he or she sells. It doesn't matter who is legally responsible. What does matter is the elasticities of demand and supply. So you can't really do this tax analysis until you've learned about elasticity. Commodity taxation finally raises revenue for the government for funding public goods and those things we want the government to do. But it also creates lost gains from trade. It distorts the market and it creates what we call a deadweight loss. So this is the part of that inevitable concept of trade-offs in economics. To have gains for the government, to have the government be able to do its function, we have to have taxes, and taxes create a loss for buyers and sellers in a market. There is no such thing as a free lunch here. And okay, so let's get more into this issue of who is really paying the tax. It doesn't depend on who writes the check, so to speak. Okay, so we can think about the government putting a tax on either sellers of the good or buyers of the good. And again, that's irrelevant. What we're interested in is what's the impact on the market itself. So we're thinking about buyers and sellers interacting at the same time. Whether a tax is placed on buyers or sellers of a good, it's going to have the exact same effect. In other words, the exact same burden of the tax is going to be split across buyers and sellers in a certain manner depending on the elasticities. So here's how we want to think about a tax on sellers. A tax on sellers is an increase in costs. Remember, the supply curve is the cost of production, and as I mentioned when talking about the determinants of supply, remember TTEP number, technology, taxes, expectations, price of inputs, number of sellers. Taxes is a direct determinant of supply. It's a higher cost of doing business. And what that's going to do is shift the supply curve up and to the left by exactly the amount of the tax. That will distort the market, so the price paid by buyers will be different than the price received by sellers. Buyers have to pay the price plus tax. Sellers get the total price minus the tax. So now we'll see we have a discrepancy, and sometimes we refer to this as the tax wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. And that is how we'll go about analyzing this in the graph. So let's say this is the market for ground beef, and here's our situation before a tax is imposed. So there's a supply curve, there's a demand curve, here's an equilibrium price. You know, we can make up a price too. Let's say it's $3 a pound. And this is for Econville, and this is the quantity per week. Remember, there's always a time frame on the quantity. You know, let's just make up a number here. Let's just say it's 1,000 pounds per week. purchased by the citizens in Econville. What happens when we add a tax on sellers? We're going to shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. And let's just say it's $1 a pound. The government says we need $1 a pound to finance the food safety infrastructure. Okay, fair enough, whatever. So $1, I'll say plus $1 tax. And what we're going to do is add, now remember, we can think about the supply curve in terms of cost, and this is the cost axis, or the money axis, the price axis, the vertical axis. So we're moving up here in price/cost space by $1. So that's where we'd be at point C. Point C would say, okay, buyers will now pay $4 per pound, the original equilibrium plus the $1 tax. But what you have to remember, what happens for buyers on the demand curve when they see a higher price? Demand slopes down. So as the price goes up, people do what? People buy less. So we're going to move away from the quantity they used to be buying. Okay? And at a price of 4, buyers would only buy this much. And that's a much smaller quantity. Now, another interesting thing happens though as we move up the demand curve. We're going to hit the supply curve plus the tax right here at point B. So we're not going to make it all the way back to this number. Let's say buyers at a price of $4 per pound would buy 600 pounds. I'm just going to make up a number per week. Well, we won't make it all the way that far because we'll stop here where the new supply curve sits, and let's say that's a quantity of 800 pounds. So what that tells us is that sellers aren't actually going to let the price go up all the way by the tax. So they're not going to let the price go all the way up to $4. The price is going to start going up, but it's going to stop going up when this new supply curve intersects the old demand curve. And what that tells us is that sellers will end up eating part of the tax as well. So buyers will eat part of the tax and sellers eat part of the tax. The burden of the tax is going to be shared amongst buyers and sellers. So here's how we want to think about that. The original price was right here at $3 a pound. Okay. The price paid by buyers, and let's just say for simplicity now that this is going to be $3.50. Buyers are going to pay $3.50. $1 of that is tax. So go down $1. What does that mean sellers receive? They receive $2.50. So we're comparing those results to the original equilibrium, which was $3 right here, right there, point A. And we're asking, well, how much of the tax did the buyers pay and the sellers pay? Well, buyers used to pay $3 per pound and now they're paying $3.50. So buyers are paying 50 cents per pound with the tax. And sellers used to receive $3 per pound and now they're only receiving $2.50. So sellers are also paying 50 cents. So the burden of the tax for the sellers, we could represent by this rectangle down here. It's the amount of the tax in money space, 50 cents, times the new quantity, 800 pounds. And the buyer's share of the tax is their 50 cents. So they paid $3.50. They used to pay $3, so they've got a 50 cents higher price because of the tax. 50 cents times the 800 pounds. So this right here, this area here in the graph represents the amount of tax. Of course, the total of the tax would be the vertical distance here, which is $1, times the 800 pounds, $800, of which $400 is borne by the buyers and $400 is borne by the sellers. Now, one thing I'll note here as well before we move on, what about the fact that we're not buying and selling as much beef as we used to sell because the tax forced the price up to some extent? Well, that is represented by the fact that there's 200 fewer pounds beef being bought and sold per week in this market, and some of the gain in that purchase would have been consumer surplus beneath the demand curve here and above the price, and some of the gain there would have been producer surplus, price greater than cost on the supply curve there. So those are just losses that nobody gets. Buyers used to buy more and now they don't buy it, so they're not so happy out here on this margin. And then sellers, same thing, they used to sell more and they're no longer selling it, so they're not happy. And we have a special term for this. It's represented by this triangle right here that I'm drawing in purple, and this is known as the deadweight loss triangle. It's consumer plus producer surplus that is gone. Nobody gets it.
You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
It is it's a pure loss of potential gains from trade that happens because the tax is imposed. So this is not to say, again, that we shouldn't have taxes and we shouldn't have the government. It's just to recognize that there's an opportunity cost of imposing taxes in order to fund what we might view as necessary government services. Okay, So that's the tax on sellers. Now, the tax on buyers is going to be very, very similar, but if we're the way we analyze it, but if we're talking about buyers here instead of sellers, well, guess what? Now we're talking about the demand curve and not the supply curve. So let's kind of think about the scenario from the perspective of the demand curve now rather than the supply curve. So look what it says first. It says a tax on buyers lowers the willingness to pay for every quantity demanded. And think about it this way. You're going into the store to buy stuff, but you know that part of that price is just the tax part. So like after you subtract the tax part, how much can you really pay to the seller? Well, it's whatever you would maximum willing to pay minus the amount of the tax. So that will cause us graphically to shift that demand curve down by the amount of the tax. That will then distort the market, so the price paid by buyers is different than the price received by sellers. The sellers pay the price with the tax included. So then what the sellers receive is what the buyers paid minus the amount of the tax. So again, we have a tax wedge in here. The tax is the difference between what the buyers pay and what the sellers receive. Tax wedge is one term for this analysis. Let's look at that in the graph, shall we? This is the market for ground beef in Econville. So the price used to sit here at $3. And we've shifted the demand curve down now by the amount of the tax, so exactly $1. So that's what we're drawing right here. Because $1 of the amount the buyers are paying is now the tax, does that mean the sellers only will keep supplying us 800 pounds of beef for $2 a pound? No, at $2 a pound, $2 a pound would actually sit right here. The sellers say we can only supply you this much beef. That's where the supply curve hits that. Maybe it's, maybe that's like 400 pounds. How much are we going to actually buy? We're actually going to buy 600 pounds, and you know that's the case because that's where the demand curve, the shifted down demand curve, hits the original supply curve. So what that indicates is that the sellers will actually wind up taking a little bit of the responsibility for the tax on themselves. We can represent that right here because the amount the buyers are willing to pay for that quantity before the tax was, let's just say it's $3.40, okay, and let's subtract $1 from that, that would be $2.40. So the amount the sellers are going to take in this case is going to be 60 cents because it's the difference between the original $3 and the $2.40 that they're going to get net after the tax. And then, so that's the seller share, 60 cents. The amount the buyers are going to, the burden for the buyers is going to be this amount up here. So as we retreated along their original demand curve, we hit a price of $3.40 and a quantity of 600 pounds. So that would be what, 40 cents. The buyers, I'm sorry, are going to pay 40 cents of the dollar tax, and the sellers, let me draw this over here, are going to pay 60 cents of the dollar tax. And once again, because we have shifted the curve and we have a lower quantity being purchased and sold, we lose out on some of the gains from trade, consumer surplus and producer surplus, that we used to enjoy. And again, the term for this whole loss here is a deadweight loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Cost of taxation is a deadweight loss, or sometimes economists will call it an excess burden of taxation. Okay, now we can put both of those together and realize that they were doing the same thing. So whether we shift the demand curve down or shift the supply curve up and to the left, the result is the same. All right, so that is how we think about imposing a unit tax or commodity tax. It's pretty easy to think it through with the supply and demand. Now, let's get into the elasticity issue. So who pays how much of the tax depends then on the relative elasticities of supply and demand. A tax creates a wedge, as I've mentioned, between price paid by buyers and the price received by sellers. Buyers will wind up paying somewhat higher of a price than the previous market equilibrium price before the tax, and sellers will wind up receiving somewhat less of a price than the previous market equilibrium before the tax. Now here's the upshot. The less elastic side of the market will pay the greater share of the tax. Remember what elasticity means: responsiveness to changes in price. If the supply curve is really inelastic, that means suppliers are just not really responsive to changes in price. They're not going to increase the quantity that much if the price goes up. They're not going to reduce the quantity that much if the price goes down. Likewise, if demand is inelastic, buyers don't care that much about price. They're not going to buy a whole lot more if the price goes down. They're not going to buy a whole lot less if the price goes up. then they'll be willing to eat the tax. So we have to find out empirically what the elasticities of supply and demand are, and then we could get a pretty accurate estimate of how exactly this tax burden will fall. Let's just jump to the graph here. When demand is more elastic than supply, sellers pay more of the tax. So here, and remember from my lecture on elasticity, the steeper curve is usually the more elastic one. The one that's more steep, remember, looks more like a capital I. So a really steep demand curve kind of looks like a capital I, and that means inelastic, versus a more flat demand curve. You can kind of see the E there, right? That's elastic. Okay, so here the demand curve is relatively flat, so that's a fairly elastic demand curve. It probably has a elasticity coefficient well above 1. And here the supply curve now is pretty steep, so it probably has an elasticity coefficient less than 1 inelastic. Now let's shift either the supply curve to the left or the demand curve to the left. Here we are shifting the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. Call that supply 2. Let's do this in orange. Or we're shifting the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. We'll call that D2. Okay. D2 minus the tax. Supply 2 is plus the tax. And either way we slice this, our result is that the price is not going to change to here. I'm sorry, the price paid by the buyers is going to be right here. The price received at point B, the price received by sellers is going to be down here at point D. And sellers are going to wind up paying, I'll highlight this in purple here, a much larger share of the tax. If this was a $1 tax, their share might here be like 80 cents. And buyers pay a much smaller chunk, which would be this little green rectangle here. And let's say that's maybe 20 cents per unit. And why is that? Well, who was more responsive to a price change? Buyers or sellers? Who had the more elastic curve? Well, the demand curve, right? This means that buyers are more responsive to a price change. And if price goes up, they buy less, right? They're more willing to just say no, walk away. Sellers here are inelastic. They're less responsive to a price change. In this case, the price is going up just because of a tax, but they're less responsive, meaning they're not going to alter their quantity that much, meaning they will, instead of just walking away from the market rather than receiving the full net price, they'll just receive kind of something closer to the old price, realizing that a big chunk of that's going to be the tax, and so the net amount they receive is going to be significantly less than it used to be. A final way to think about this is who's in more of a position to say no to the tax? That would be the curve that's more elastic. More elastic says, if the price goes up, I leave, I walk away. Say no, no dice. And in this case, that's the buyers. If it were flipped around, if we had a supply curve that was really elastic and a demand curve that was really inelastic, well then we could put the tax on the buyers more easily, right? So here we'll summarize that. When the supply curve is more elastic than the demand curve, buyers will bear a larger burden of the tax. Another way of saying that is if demand is more inelastic than supply. Let's graph that one out. Okay, so now I have a demand curve that's a little bit more inelastic, a little steeper than the supply curve. We can see that with a tax imposed, and it's, again, doesn't matter if we shift the cost curve, the supply curve up, S2, here would be the demand curve in orange. Now because demand was less elastic, buyers were not as willing to walk away, they are going to take a larger hit from the tax. That's going to be represented by this green rectangle. And again, let's just assume that the tax is $1. So here's the tax wedge of $1 per item in here. And you can see buyers are paying something like, I don't know, 80 cents of that. And that means sellers are paying what? Well, they'd only be paying 20 cents, right? So the seller's burden would be this chunk right down here, this rectangle down here. So who pays a tax? It depends on elasticity. Who's more willing to walk away? Who's got the more elastic curve? They pay less of the tax. Who's more stuck with having to buy or sell this and not being very responsive to price? That's whoever's more inelastic, they're going to pay more. Okay, so we can summarize now. A commodity tax raises revenue for the government but creates lost gains from trade, which again we call a deadweight loss. Government revenue from the tax equals the amount of the tax times the quantity that's purchased after the tax is imposed, and we know that's less than the quantity purchased before the tax. And the deadweight loss, as I noted previously, is represented by that triangle between the quantity before the tax, equilibrium quantity before the tax, and the equilibrium quantity after the tax. And we can summarize those elements with this graph here. So if you're studying for the quiz, you might want to take a good look at this, copy this into your note. And I'll remind you, you don't have to draw this in, but we can analyze this, remember, either by shifting the supply curve up by the amount of the tax, or shifting the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. And here's the price that sellers receive. Here's the price buyers pay. And of course, you notice that that is not the same. The difference is the tax. So buyers pay this, government gets this, sellers receive this. This is trades that don't happen because the price is driven up above the original equilibrium and the quantity is driven below. This represents the tax revenue. Some of that's paid by buyers, some of that's paid by sellers. And then the remaining producer and consumer surplus, you'll note, is also lower. The producer and consumer surplus that remain are shrunk down because the government took a big chunk of their surplus. It kind of took, you can think about it as taking it out of the profits of the sellers or out of the net gain of the buyers. Okay, so let's get into an application for sales taxes. On which products do governments actually impose commodity taxes? And we'll think about this from the consumer's perspective. So do you want to tax products that have elastic demand, in other words, are easy for people to say no to? Or do you want to tax products that have inelastic demand that's very difficult for consumers to reduce their consumption of? So, as an example, think about this. If the government put a tax on only Oreo cookies, not cookies in general, but just Oreo cookies, well, what would happen? People would probably cut way back on their consumption of Oreo cookies, and they would buy other kinds of cookies. There's dozens of other cookie varieties out there, right? So that's an elastic product. You want to think about a product that's demanded inelastically. Here are three of the products that we have commodity taxes on at the federal level: gasoline, cigarettes, and alcohol. If you think about gasoline, if you own a gas-powered car, it's very difficult for you to avoid buying gasoline. You'd have to sell your gas-powered car and get an electric car or a diesel car or something else. So for the vast majority of us who do own cars, we own gas-powered cars. Therefore, we're just going to have to suck up and face the gasoline tax. You'll notice that the thing that all of these products have in common is that they have inelastic demand curves. Okay, now we'll spend just a couple more minutes here and we'll wrap up our discussion by talking about subsidies. So you want to realize, first of all, that a subsidy is just a reverse tax or an anti-tax. So instead of taking money from you when you buy or sell a certain product, a subsidy is where the government gives you money to help you buy or sell a certain product. It's the opposite of a tax. It's an anti-tax. So here's some truths about subsidies. You'll notice the parallels with taxes. Who gets the subsidy, in other words, who ends up benefiting from a subsidy, does not depend on who receives the check from the government. The subsidy could be directed at the buyers or directed at the sellers, but ultimately who gets it will depend on the relative elasticities of the demand curve and the supply curve. And subsidies finally are paid for ultimately by taxpayers because the government gets its money to pay the subsidy from its source of revenue, which is the taxpayers. And like taxes, subsidies create deadweight losses. So let's take a look at how subsidies work, how we shift the supply or demand curve to analyze a subsidy, and we'll also think about who gets the bigger benefit of a subsidy based on elasticity in this supply and demand diagram. So here, which is more inelastic? Which is a steeper curve, which is less responsive to a price change? Well, here you can see that the supply curve is steeper than the demand curve, so the supply curve would be more inelastic. Okay, and you'll notice the price received by the sellers, and that is where the new demand curve would hit the old supply curve, so that's right here. We'll label that P sub S for price sellers get. You'll notice that's quite a bit above the old equilibrium price, so that would be the seller's share of the subsidy. I'm going to highlight this with the red slashes here. And that's a lot bigger chunk of the subsidy change than, let's do in green, the price paid by buyers down here. And this is where the old demand curve hits the new supply curve, so that's right here. So that would be the reduction in price would be the buyer's cut of the subsidy. So I'll hash that in green. And you'll notice that the sellers get it. Obviously, you can look at that red hashed rectangle. That's bigger than the green rectangle. So the sellers here get a bigger cut of the subsidy because they had more inelastic supply, and the demand curve is fairly elastic here. If the demand curve were inelastic, if the demand curve were steeper and the supply curve were flatter, then the buyers would get the bigger cut of the subsidy. And finally, we want to note that subsidies create deadweight losses just like taxes. And this is because we're moving beyond that optimal quantity where marginal benefit just equaled marginal cost. We're moving into a range where the cost of producing the good is higher than the actual consumer benefit. Now, the apparent consumer benefit goes up because the government's paying part of the consumer's cost, or vice versa. We can say that the apparent cost of production for those suppliers seems lower because the government's covering part of that cost, but that's only apparent. The true cost of production is actually above the true marginal value for consumers, and that causes a loss, which is an inefficiency, and that's eaten by the taxpayers. And taxpayers often don't even know about this because there's so many things that the government's spending money on that it's too hard to keep track. So let's briefly take a look at what that looks like in the graph. So the subsidy causes us to increase quantity beyond the equilibrium quantity, and at this quantity where we are in the demand curve, that would be the marginal value of the product, is way less than where we are here on the supply curve. And remember, that's the marginal cost of the product. And what's true here at our subsidy quantity? Well, marginal cost is greater than marginal value. In other words, the cost of producing these units of the good is greater than the value for consumers to use them. And when cost is greater than value, we normally don't want that to occur. Why? Because scarce resources have alternative uses. And the alternative uses of these resources are somewhere where they were in a market where the value was above the cost, as represented over here with the total surplus triangle. So as long as the supply curve is above the demand curve, which it is in this entire area out here, we've got this kind of inefficiency occurring. So we call that a deadweight loss or an excess burden of subsidies. Let's take a quick look at some subsidized goods and then we'll wrap up. We have a lot of subsidies in the US. The federal government in particular heavily subsidizes both education and healthcare services, among many other products. The first result is that consumers are able to spend more on the product. We shift the demand curve up and to the right by the amount of the subsidy. Feels like you have more to spend because you do. Government's paying for part of it. Producers operate in an inefficient range of the supply curve. As I just mentioned, cost is above price in this range. And in industries where production is not competitive, producers often capture a lot of the subsidies for themselves in the form of higher prices. So I'll give you examples of that later on. We'll talk again about subsidies. But for now, we will wrap up and we will move on to some other applications of elasticity. See you soon.